Hello to you. I do hope you're well, and welcome to this A-level religious studies video. I'm Ben Wardle, and today we are revising process theology and process theodicy. So plenty to talk about today with regards to process theology. And our key question today will be, can this be seen as a Christian understanding of God? Because of course, our process theologians change a lot of those traditional Christian ideas about God. For example, they say that God is not omnipotent and that he did not create everything out of nothing. And so whilst you could say that process theology helps to resolve the problem of evil, it also creates many more problems for Christians as well, in particular our more traditional Christians. And that is why Roth says that the God of process theology is a weak and pathetic God who is not worthy of worship. So lots to talk about today, as I say, and lots of judgments to make as well as to whether you think process theology can solve the problem of evil. And that, of course, is when we talk about process theodicy, but also whether you think it actually creates even more problems for Christians because it arrives at an understanding of God that completely contradicts those traditional Christian beliefs. For example, that God is omnipotent and that he created everything out of nothing. So, as I say, plenty for us to talk through today. Our two key scholars that we'll be referring to are David Griffin, who we'll be using as our supporter of process theology, and then our key critic will be John Roth. And as I mentioned, he said that process theologians believe in a weak and pathetic God who is not worthy of worship. And he's talking there in the context of the problem of evil and the idea that if God is not able to stop something like the Holocaust, then what is the point of worshipping this God? So this is a really great topic, not only because we can bring it into many different areas of the course, and I'll show you where you can bring this in on paper 1 and paper 2 in just a moment, but also because it really helps us to get off the fence, which is what we need to do to secure that A star. When you're talking about process theology, I always think it's quite hard to sit on the fence and be neutral. It's one of those ideas and one of those areas of the course that really gets conversation and debate going. So it is important you are making that judgment as to whether you think process theology is a Christian theology and whether it is consistent with Christian beliefs about God. And as I mentioned, this is a topic, this is an area of the course that you can make lots of synoptic links to. So you can bring process theology in to many of your answers, both on paper 1 and on paper 2. For example, arguments for the existence of God, as well as the problem of evil and suffering, which is when we do talk about process theodicy as a response to the problem of evil and suffering. And that response is to say, well, God is not omnipotent, therefore he is not all powerful. You can't then ask, why doesn't God do something? Because you accept he cannot. It is not within his nature. He does not possess omnipotence. And instead, process theologians emphasize God's immanence. They say God has a panentheistic relationship with the universe, and so he shares alongside us in our suffering. We can also bring this in when we talk about miracles and the anti-realist understanding of miracles, and of course then life after death as well. What does it mean to talk about life after death for process theologians? They believe that it means to live on in the mind of God as a memory. And we'll be asking again, does that then contradict those traditional Christian beliefs about life after death as either a physical place that you go or a spiritual state that you are in? We will then, of course, be talking about process theology on paper 2 as well, when we talk about sources of wisdom and authority. And we'll be asking, is this consistent with the Bible, with the teachings of the church and the teachings of Jesus himself when it comes to that Christian understanding of God? This topic, of course, is very important when we do talk about God, and one of our key areas of the God topic for paper 2 is process theology. And again, it's about making those comparisons with those more traditional Christian beliefs about God, in particular when it comes to his omnipotence and also to the idea of creation ex nihilo, that God created everything out of nothing. We'll also be bringing this in when we talk about gender, and in particular, we talk about ideas of God as a father, because, of course, as I've mentioned, process theology contradicts a lot of traditional Christian theology. So could this actually be a way of resolving some of the sexism that is seen within the religion by reimagining God and almost redefining God as not being this omnipotent father, but as having this panentheistic relationship with the world? We'll talk about process theology when we talk about religious pluralism and different ideas about whether all religions can be true or whether Christianity is the exclusive source of salvation. And then, of course, as with every topic, we can bring this into our dialogues answers, because in those dialogues questions, one of our key skills is that we are able to make those links and connections across the course. So I always think that process theology is a great topic to be including in your dialogues answers. And we'll be talking about what you could include in those answers as we go through today's video. So yes, hopefully that just gives you an idea and an oversight as to how many links you can make between the different paper 1 topics and the different paper 2 topics, in the fact that you can bring process theology in. I do hope that all makes sense. Hopefully it will become clearer and those links will become more apparent as we go through today's video. So let's actually get started with today's video. And I think it's really important we start by establishing and setting out the traditional Christian beliefs about God, because as I say, process theology is seen as challenging these traditional Christian beliefs. And so we will be asking, is there any way of reconciling what traditional Christians believe with what process theologians believe? Or actually, are we going to be criticizing process theology as un-Christian because it contradicts the Bible and it goes against traditional Christian teachings? And so, as I mentioned before, whilst we might say that it helps to resolve the problem of evil, does it actually create even more problems because it goes against these traditional Christian beliefs? So what are these traditional Christian beliefs? Well, of course, the main one we'll be talking about today is the idea of omnipotence, the idea that God is all powerful. And on the God topic for paper 2, we do talk about what omnipotence actually means. Does that mean God can do absolutely anything, including the logically impossible? Or does it mean that God can do the logically possible? For example, can God sin? Or can God make 2 add 2 equal 5? So really interesting debates within the God topic on paper 2 about what omnipotence actually means. But in terms of our headline definition, it means that God is all powerful. Traditionally, Christians also believe that God is omniscient, which means he is all-knowing. And again, that raises really interesting questions about free will, doesn't it? If God knows the future, does that not compromise our free will? Because if he already knows what you're going to do, have you freely chosen to do it? In terms of omnibenevolence, this means all loving. And of course, Christians do believe that God is all loving, although, of course, some parts of the Old Testament do seem to contradict that. And that is why Richard Dawkins, a very famous atheist, said that the God of the Old Testament is the cruelest character in all of fiction in terms of the things that he does. I mean, Noah's Ark is one example, isn't it? That he floods the entire world and just saves a couple of people on the ark. But that is one of our traditional Christian beliefs. And of course, Christians do associate that with Jesus and his death on the cross, that God loved the world so much that he was prepared for his only son to be sacrificed on the cross. And that is the act of atonement that pays the price for human sinfulness and restores the relationship between God and humanity. Another traditional belief is that God is eternal. That is the belief that God has always existed and he will always exist. So he is outside of space and time, which leads to our next key term, transcendence. And so that means that he can be the creator of everything. And traditionally, Christians believe God created everything out of nothing. So he has always existed and he will always exist. And at some point, he brought the universe into existence. And that leads us actually to the final traditional belief, which is that God is the creator of the universe. And we see that in the Genesis creation story, of course, and this is seen in the doctrine of creation ex nihilo, which is a Latin term for creation out of nothing. And that reaffirms God's omnipotence. It's the idea that God created everything out of nothing. So they are our traditional Christian beliefs, and it's really important that you keep them in mind when we are talking through process theology and then we are critiquing process theology, because we want to be comparing what process theologians believe with traditional Christian beliefs so that we can then make a judgment as to whether process theology can be described as a Christian theology. So what is process theology? Let's talk through the headlines, shall we? If we look at the context and the background, it was very much influenced by A.N. Whitehead's process philosophy, and it was then developed into a theology by scholars such as David Griffin. And the key beliefs here are, number one, that God is not omnipotent, and number two, that God did not create the universe out of nothing. So as I say, if we then make a link and a comparison to those traditional Christian beliefs, can we say that process theology is a Christian theology if they are denying and rejecting the idea that God is omnipotent, and if they are denying and rejecting the idea that God created the universe out of nothing? And of course, this raises questions, doesn't it, in terms of, well, what do they believe about God? Well, let me tell you, they believe that the relationship between God and the universe is panentheistic. This means that the universe exists within God and that God exists within the universe. So whereas traditionally Christians would see God as higher than and above the universe, because remember, he is the transcendent creator and controller, for process theologians, that relationship is a mutual one in terms of God and the universe are equal and that they need each other. Process theologians believe that both God and the universe have always existed eternally, and that the universe is within God and God is within the universe. So it's very much about this relationship between them. And that is a relationship that works both ways. It's not a case of God being outside of space and time and creating everything, but he's in this continuous, ongoing, dynamic, if I can call it that, relationship with the universe. And so this means that both the universe and God exist eternally. So whereas, of course, our traditional Christian view is that God is eternal and that he then created the universe out of nothing, our process theologians believe that there are two things that are eternal. Number one is God, and number two is the universe. So he didn't create it out of nothing. Instead, he persuaded it and fashioned it into what it is today over a prolonged period of time. And again, does that not contradict our more traditional Christian beliefs? That's what we'll be talking about in terms of our critical analysis. And so just a final point here is that God is involved within the universe and the universe is involved within God. And that is that panentheistic relationship where they are constantly interacting with each other and they have this mutual dependency on one another. And again, that raises questions about God's nature, doesn't it? Because if God is, as traditional Christians believe, omnipotent and transcendent, he should not be depending on the universe at all, should he? So does this not go against traditional Christian views? Well, let's get a bit more detail now, shall we? Let's actually unpack this a little bit more. Our process theologians, such as Griffin, remember, make sure you're referring to scholars in every paragraph, they believe that God did not create everything out of nothing. Instead, they believe that God and the universe have both always existed eternally. They believe that God then fashioned pre-existing matter into what it is today. And importantly, he used the power of persuasion rather than domination. And I think, again, domination is a word we would link to omnipotence, wouldn't we? And that, again, reflects the fact they reject omnipotence. And so God works using the power of persuasion within the complexity of the process rather than dominating over it. And so they believe God persuades chaotic matter into organized forms over time. So remember, the universe has always existed, God has always existed, and then over time, God fashioned and persuaded the universe, in particular that chaotic matter, into the organized form we see it in today. And so if we deep dive into that idea of omnipotence, our process theologians believe that God is powerful, but that he is not omnipotent. And again, it raises questions, doesn't it, about what omnipotence actually means. For process theologians, they believe that God cannot control the physical aspect of the universe any more than the human mind can control the internal workings of its body. So in the same way, you can't sit here and say, right, I want my heart to stop beating now. God cannot control the physical aspects of the universe. So they very much see God as like the mind or the soul of the universe. And again, that then links into their beliefs about life after death, and that to have life after death means to live on in the mind of God. So it is interesting to consider this example they give of God being powerful but not omnipotent. So in the same way that you can't mentally control the internal workings of your body, God can't exert domination over the physical workings of the universe. And again, is that too much of a move away from traditional Christian beliefs? Or could we actually say this is a better way of understanding God? They believe then in terms of creation that it is not this process of domination. So it's not that God created everything out of nothing in the traditional Christian sense, but instead it's a much longer process of persuasion. So it's about encouragement and persuasion rather than domination. Let's talk then more about creation, shall we? Because this is a really great case study within process theology. If you're talking about what they believe about God, a great focus point is on creation. So we know that they don't see God as omnipotent, and it's important we know that they reject the creation ex nihilo doctrine. They believe that both the universe and God are both omnipotent, and that God then persuaded and fashioned pre-existing matter into an ordered universe. So you have not got this transcendent God that then creates and controls everything. Remember, there is that panentheistic relationship, and God is persuading and fashioning. Process theologians would therefore, of course, reject the traditional biblical creation story. So again, if we talk about whether this is consistent with Christian beliefs, we could say, well, it actually goes against what the Bible says, because the Bible says that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And of course, if we're saying that he didn't do that, we are contradicting scripture. And that is then our link to sources of wisdom and authority, isn't it? So they say God did not create everything in 6 days, followed by a day of rest, but instead it was this long-term process of persuasion. Now, interestingly, for Griffin, he doesn't believe that to be a process theologian means you have to reject the Bible. He actually says that there is an alternative translation of Genesis 1, of course he does, that it actually underpins and supports his idea of God. And so he says that instead of saying that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, we actually need to have a different understanding and take a different translation of Genesis 1:1. He says that it should be translated as this, that in the beginning of God's creating the heavens and the earth being without form and void, and darkness being upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moving over the face of the waters, God said, let there be light, and there was light. So the key line there is that in the beginning of God's creating. So it's not that he created as this outsider, but that he persuaded as this insider who's very much involved within the process, and that, as I say, he is persuading and guiding rather than dominating over. Now, in this second translation, as I say, it suggests he believed that the earth already existed as it is being. So it is there, but it is in a formless state. So as we said, we've got that chaotic matter that's all over the place. And so God needs to come along to persuade it and fashion it into something more stable. This suggests that matter has existed eternally in a simple, chaotic, formless state, and that God's act of creation was to give form and order to it, but not to actually create it from nothing. So I would be really interested to hear actually in the comments below what you think of this. Do you think this is a better understanding of Genesis, or do you think he's gone off on a complete tangent and he has lost the original meaning of Genesis to the extent that a Christian would be rejecting this translation and then his beliefs about God? So do you think you can be a Christian and say that God is not omnipotent and that he did not create everything out of nothing? Or is that too much of a contradiction with those core Christian beliefs? Now, as I mentioned, it's really important that we also talk about process theology in the context of the problem of evil and suffering, because process theodicy is a way of resolving the problem of evil and suffering. And remember that a theodicy is a defense of God. And as I've mentioned, our process theologians develop a defense of God by denying God's omnipotence. And we've got to then ask, well, does that then resolve the problem of evil and suffering by saying, well, God is not omnipotent, therefore he can't do anything about it? And at the same time, does it then raise even more problems and questions as to whether, as Ross is going to ask, this God is actually worthy of worship? So process theology, I can't speak, do excuse me. Process theologians, there we go, seek to resolve the problem of evil and suffering by teaching that God is not omnipotent or transcendent. So again, is that too much of a contradiction? Are they going too far off course? And would a traditional Christian, as a result, find this an unsatisfactory resolution to the problem of evil? They believe that God has not created evil and he cannot intervene to prevent evil. Instead, as the soul of the universe, as we've said, he's like the mind and the soul of the universe. He has this pantheistic relationship with it. They believe he actually shares in all suffering. So they're emphasizing God's closeness, his immanence, and, the fact that he is alongside us, as opposed to emphasizing his domination and his transcendence. So although he can't do anything about it, they're saying, don't worry, because he's experiencing it alongside you. And so we've got to then ask, and this is where our critical analysis comes in, whether that is a satisfactory explanation and resolution, or whether, as Ross is going to say, this God can't be worthy of worship. They believe that God is blameless and that he suffers alongside us. And I think that is your key bullet point, really, when it comes to their resolution. Because they say God is not omnipotent, he can't be blamed. He can't actually do anything. And then they emphasize that pantheistic relationship with God and the universe in order to illustrate he is suffering alongside us. Now, of course, we've got examples of that. We could say, for example, Jesus dying on the cross. But again, is that too much of a price to pay in order to resolve the problem of evil and suffering? That, okay, we're going to deny God's omnipotence so that we can't then blame him for not intervening, but at what cost? Does that then move us away from a Christian God who is worthy of worship? I just want to touch on another topic. Let's talk about another paper one topic, which is miracles, and where you could bring process theology in here. Because, of course, our process theologians would reject the idea that a transcendent and omnipotent God would be intervening to perform miracles. And, of course, that is your realist view of miracles. They would say that God cannot break laws of nature because God works within the world and its processes. Remember, he uses persuasion rather than domination. So for a process theologian, they would be great to support the anti-realist view because God is working within the universe and the universe is within God. So there isn't this abstract, dominating, transcendent God who can just choose to intervene within human history. Instead, remember, it's that long-term process of persuasion. And so our process theologians could be used to support Tillich when he said that miracles cannot be interpreted in terms of a supernatural interference in natural processes, because again, that key focus point for process theologians is that God persuades rather than dominates. Let's have a look at another topic now, shall we? And this is life after death. So again, another great opportunity to be bringing process theology in. Our process theologians reject subjective immortality, the idea that we continue to exist as identifiable individual beings after death. Instead, they believe that we live forever in the mind of God. So as I say, they don't believe in that traditional Christian idea of human beings living in a place called heaven or being tormented in hell. Instead, remember, they believe that God is the mind of the universe. And so you live on in the mind of God. And we've got to ask again, does that actually, satisfy a Christian as an understanding? They believe that we survive in the mind of God. Our actions, thoughts, and ideas exist eternally as objects in the memory of God. And is that, do you think, consistent with the Bible? Is that consistent with traditional Christian beliefs as well? Very important that we consider that in terms of, well, okay, That might be easier to believe because you're then not expected to believe that there is a physical place where we go after death. And of course, we know all the criticisms of that in terms of, well, do I have my physical body? Do I get a new one? Is there room? Does my body age in heaven? All of those questions about it being a physical place, we can say, well, look, that's all resolved because you don't believe it's a physical place. But again, it then seems to raise even more questions, doesn't it? In terms of, well, is this Christian? Is this what Jesus was talking about when he spoke about my Father's house has many rooms, for example? He didn't say God's mind has lots of room to remember you. So we have to be thinking, is this a satisfactory understanding of life after death for Christians, or is it actually too contradictory? And therefore, process theology would be rejected by most Christians today. Now, as I mentioned, we need to also consider, and we've started to do that, haven't we, how this comes in when we talk about process theodicy, because process theodicy is how Christians who follow process theology, if of course we can call them Christians, respond to the problem of evil. And of course, it is about resolving the logical problem and the evidential problem. Remember, we know they believe God did not create the universe out of nothing. They believe God is not omnipotent or transcendent. Therefore, God did not create evil and God cannot intervene to stop or remove it. Instead, God shares in the suffering of the universe and he has that panentheistic relationship with the universe. This means, of course, that the problem of evil is resolved because you're denying God's omnipotence when we think about Epicurus's inconsistent triad. So you're resolving that by saying, well, yeah, God is not omnipotent. But I think a great question to then ask in your answer is, but at what cost? As we're going to look at now when we look at our AO2 evaluation for wrath, this means that God is weak and pathetic and is not worthy of worship. So let's get on to that AO2 evaluation, shall we? Hopefully you've started to make some judgments and do some critical analysis in terms of whether you think process theology and process theodicy is a satisfactory understanding of God and whether it is a satisfactory resolution to the problem of evil and suffering. Let's start by talking about the strength, shall we? And of course, a key strength, you could say, is that it is a resolution to the problem of evil, and in particular, the logical problem, which is where we think of Epicurus's triangle and those three statements that God is omnipotent, God is omnibenevolent, and that evil does exist, because of course you are denying God's omnipotence. So actually the logical problem is solved by denying God's omnipotence. But of course our key question will be, but at what cost? Let's have a look at the strengths. Process theology has an answer to the problem of evil by saying that God is not omnipotent, and of course that he then suffers alongside us, so he is just as much of a victim as we are. Therefore, we might feel closer to God, and it is possible to reconcile the existence of God with the existence of evil, because God does not have the power to control it. Remember, he is powerful, but he's not omnipotent. If we're going to do some critical analysis here, and of course that is very important for getting your A star, we could then say, however, omnipotence is seen as one of the key characteristics of God by most Christians. It is a key teaching from the Bible. Remember, Jesus says that with God all things are possible. And so we have to ask, is a God who lacks omnipotence a Christian God? And is that God worthy of worship? Ross says no. He says this is a weak and pathetic God who is not worthy of worship. Another strength is that it presents God as close to his people and sharing in their suffering. And we can say that is a good thing because it emphasizes his omnibenevolence and his closeness. So obviously this is not deism, where you've got a God who's created the world and then just left it. He's very much involved with the world through this panentheistic relationship. And of course, we then need to explain why that would be seen as a strength. And we do that by saying that God is close to humanity, and it reinforces and, really emphasizes his omnibenevolence. So what can we say about this? Process theology presents God as sharing in humanity's suffering because he is the soul of the universe and has a panentheistic relationship with it. Therefore, people feel closer to God, which can be a reassurance during times of suffering. It also, of course, takes away the blame potentially given to him. So, of course, we've got that closeness, but again, let's ask, at what cost? What about our weaknesses then? Our first one is, why would God start a process he could not control, especially considering the outcome? So we could say it is not clear why God would intentionally start a process by fashioning the universe that he could not then control, that he didn't then have omnipotence over, especially if he has the omniscience to know the ultimate outcome, the quantity of evil and suffering that would ultimately end up in the universe. So what reason did God have to go ahead with the process that he would lose all power over and that would end up leading to so much unnecessary evil and suffering for humanity? So why did he start fashioning the universe if he had the omniscience to know he would lose complete control and there would then be so much evil and suffering? So you could bring in the evidential problem of evil and suffering here. However, of course, if you wanted to critically analyze that, you could say that God now suffers alongside humanity, so he does have empathy. But again, the question is, okay, we've denied God's omnipotence, we're not denying his omniscience. So if he knew he would eventually lose control and there'd be so much evil and suffering, why did he engage in that process of fashioning and persuading the universe? Is it really a good idea, or was it really a good idea? Another weakness is that it cannot defend the Christian God, of course. Process theology says that God is not omnipotent and did not create the world out of nothing. This, of course, goes against the creation ex nihilo doctrine. It goes against the creation story in Genesis. And of course, it goes against mainstream Christian thinking. Therefore, we can say that this Theodicy fails to defend the Christian God. And finally, let's bring in John Ross, shall we? Because he said that if God is not omnipotent, then he is a weak and pathetic God who is not worthy of worship. And he wrote this, that by the implications of Griffin's theory, when somebody arrived at Auschwitz, the best that God could possibly do was to permit 10,000 Jews a day to go up in smoke. A God of such weakness, no matter how much he suffers alongside you, is rather pathetic. Good though he may be, Griffin's God is too small. So he's saying there that he has got such weakness and he is rather pathetic. So if God is lacking omnipotence, he would not be worthy of worship. And he's using there the case study of the horrors of World War II and the Holocaust, that if this God really couldn't have done anything to stop such an awful atrocity going on, then this is a God of such weakness, and that God is rather pathetic. And so even though if you're saying, well, God is omnibenevolent and he suffers alongside you, he says that that God is too small. And so he is not satisfied by this resolution to the problem of evil. And so he rejects process theodicy. And so let's just bring all those points together, shall we? And then make a judgment as to whether you think process theology, and in particular process theodicy, can be seen as a successful response to the problem of evil and suffering, or whether this leads us to a very unchristian understanding of God, and to an understanding of God being weak, pathetic, and not worthy of worship. So very interested to hear your thoughts on this. Please do let me know in the comments below. I do hope that's been a helpful revision video, and I wish you all the very best with your studies. Bye bye for now.